Richmond, Virginia, in the first half of the 19th century, functioned as a city built on calculation. Every street, every warehouse, every private home existed inside a system designed to extract labor while suppressing resistance. Wealth moved quietly through contracts, shipments, and inheritance, while violence remained ever present but rarely discussed openly. The city's most influential families lived in carefully maintained houses that projected order, morality, and stability. What sustained that image was not only money, but discipline, enforced daily, invisibly, and without appeal. The house at the center of this story stood among others like it, brick-built, balanced in proportion, its windows aligned to signal control rather than comfort. Inside, nothing was accidental. Furniture remained in fixed positions. Meals were served at precise hours. Servants moved according to an internal schedule learned through repetition and punishment rather than instruction. The household was not loud, chaotic, or visibly cruel. Its authority expressed itself through quiet expectation and the certainty that consequences required no explanation. The main character was an enslaved house servant assigned to work almost entirely indoors. He had been there long enough to understand that proximity to power did not mean protection. It meant exposure. Each day began before sunrise, not because the household required it, but because delay created suspicion. He washed, dressed, and prepared himself in silence, careful not to wake those who shared the cramped sleeping quarters reserved for the enslaved servants. There was no privacy, only the absence of immediate supervision. His work placed him in rooms where conversations occurred under the assumption that he was not listening. He carried trays, arranged chairs, poured drinks, and stood behind family members during meals, close enough to hear every word, close enough to be blamed if something went wrong. He did not speak unless spoken to. He did not look surprised, offended, or curious. These behaviors were not natural to him. They were learned responses, shaped over years by correction, threat, and observation of what happened to others who failed to master them. Trust, in that household, was defined narrowly. The master of the house trusted the main character to perform tasks without error and without curiosity. The mistress trusted him to remain emotionally neutral, to exist as a function rather than a presence. This trust allowed him access to spaces denied to most enslaved people, including private rooms, locked cabinets, and moments when the family believed itself unobserved. That access did not elevate him. It placed him closer to danger. Other enslaved servants understood this dynamic even if they did not articulate it. Some watched him carefully. Others avoided him. One younger man assigned to physical labor rarely spoke to him anymore, as if proximity itself carried risk. An older woman who had survived decades in the house spoke to him only when necessary, and even then with her back turned. Survival depended on knowing when not to be seen together. The overseer arrived regularly, sometimes daily, sometimes without warning. He was not employed solely by the household, but his authority extended over it. He inspected locks, questioned servants, and reminded everyone of the consequences of disobedience without raising his voice. When he spoke to the enslaved, his tone was neutral, almost polite, which made it harder to anticipate when punishment would follow. Violence delivered calmly left fewer opportunities for resistance. On the morning the first disruption occurred, nothing appeared different at first. Breakfast was served on time. The mistress took her seat. The master read correspondence while eating. The main character stood behind the mistress, adjusting her chair by a fraction of an inch, exactly as she preferred. No one acknowledged him. This was normal. Later that morning, a carriage stopped at the gate unexpectedly. The driver spoke quickly to the master, who stepped outside without his coat. From his position inside the house, the main character heard fragments of the exchange but not its meaning. He continued his work, polishing silverware in the side room, because pausing without instruction invited attention. By midday, the information spread through the house without being announced. A man from a neighboring elite household had died during the night. He had been found in his bed by his wife. There were no visible injuries. No signs of forced entry. No reports of illness in the days prior. The doctor had no immediate explanation and offered none that satisfied the family. The response inside the house was not emotional. It was procedural. The mistress ordered the doors locked earlier in the evening. She instructed that all food be tasted before serving. She limited which servants could enter certain rooms. The overseer increased his presence and questioned everyone about their movements during the previous days. No one was accused directly. Suspicion did not need to be stated to be understood. Among the enslaved servants, the death circulated as a whisper. No one spoke of it openly. Death itself was common enough not to shock, but this death belonged to someone whose position suggested immunity. That distinction mattered. When the powerful died without explanation, the system reacted by tightening its grip. That evening, as the main character cleared the dining table, he noticed a detail that seemed insignificant at the time. One glass remained half full, set slightly apart from the others. The mistress had not touched it. The master had gestured it away earlier. The main character collected it with the rest of the tableware and emptied it without comment. This was not an act of decision. It was routine. That night, sleep did not come easily. The house settled into its familiar sounds, floorboard shifting, distant doors closing, the controlled quiet of order restored. Lying on his narrow pallet, the main character remembered another house from years earlier, another moment when fear had demanded a response from the enslaved population and punishment had been delivered without proof. The memory did not arrive as images or sounds. It arrived as understanding. When anxiety reached a certain point, someone would be made to answer for it. The following day, the overseer questioned everyone again. His questions were repetitive, designed to test consistency rather than uncover truth. When he addressed the main character, his tone changed slightly, not hostile but attentive. "You were serving that evening," he said. "Yes, sir," the main character replied. "Did you notice anything unusual?" "No, sir." The overseer watched him closely, searching for hesitation or emotion. Finding none, he nodded and moved on. The exchange lasted only moments, but the main character understood that he had been noted. Within the week, a second death occurred. This time it was a woman related by marriage to the first man, living only a few streets away. Again, no signs of violence. Again, no explanation that satisfied anyone. The pattern, though unspoken, became impossible to ignore. The city did not panic publicly. Public acknowledgement of instability threatened business and reputation. Privately, however, routines changed. Social visits were cancelled. Servants were watched more closely. Food preparation became a source of anxiety rather than ceremony. In the house where the main character lived, the mistress insisted on supervising the kitchen herself. She stood near the servants as they worked, her questions precise and her attention unwavering. She did not accuse anyone. She did not need to. Her presence alone altered behavior. The main character adapted as he always had. He spoke less. He moved with greater care. He observed who avoided him and who watched him too closely. One evening, as he passed the older woman in the corridor, she whispered without turning her head, "Keep quiet." He did not respond. Acknowledgement itself could be dangerous. Despite the tension, the master hosted a small gathering of trusted men. Only those whose names carried weight were invited. The main character served them drinks and listened as they spoke in low voices about trade, politics, and finally, cautiously, about the deaths. One of the men mentioned poison. The word was introduced carefully, framed as speculation rather than accusation. The group discussed it briefly and dismissed it just as carefully. Poison required access, knowledge, and intent. No one said who might possess those things, but the implication did not need articulation. That night, after the guests left, the main character overheard a conversation between the mistress and the overseer. Hidden by a thin wall, folding linens, he heard her voice tighten as she spoke. "They are starting to say it," she said. "If this continues." "I will handle it," the overseer replied. "How?" "By making sure no one forgets their place." The next morning, a servant from another household was punished publicly in the yard. The accusation was theft. The timing made the message clear. Fear required reinforcement. Days passed without another death, but the tension did not diminish. It concentrated. One afternoon, while organizing correspondence in the study, the main character handled letters that referenced the first death and expressed concern about household safety. One letter mentioned measures taken without explanation. He returned it to its place without reading further. That evening, the mistress fell ill. Her symptoms were mild, but the reaction was immediate. A doctor was summoned. He declared exhaustion. She recovered by morning. Nothing was said aloud, but the main character noticed the change. Her eyes followed him more closely after that. In the kitchen, the older woman spoke again. "They will choose someone," she said. "They always do." That night, as the main character prepared the final tray, he noticed another glass left untouched. He paused briefly, then carried it away as he always did. The house remained intact. The system functioned. But a sequence had begun, and silence alone would no longer be enough. The absence of another death did not bring relief to the city's elite households. Instead, it allowed fear to settle into routine. Richmond had long experience maintaining appearances under strain, and this moment was no exception. Officially, nothing was wrong. Commerce continued, church services were attended, correspondence flowed as usual. Privately, however, behavior shifted in ways that revealed where anxiety was being directed. The burden did not fall on those with influence. It fell on those whose bodies and movements could be controlled. In the house where the main character lived, new rules appeared without being announced as rules. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now secured after dusk. Keys were removed from familiar hooks and kept on the master's person. Servants were instructed to wait for permission before entering rooms where they had previously moved freely. These changes were framed as precautions, but no one pretended they applied equally to everyone. The overseer's presence became constant. He arrived early and left late, sometimes sleeping in a nearby outbuilding rather than returning to his own quarters. His inspections grew more intrusive. He checked hands for stains, breath for unfamiliar smells, pockets for objects that did not belong. He questioned servants about one another, not directly accusing but inviting suspicion to take shape. Each question forced a choice: deflect attention or redirect it. The main character understood that his position inside the house made him both valuable and vulnerable. He was summoned more frequently, asked to stand closer during conversations, instructed to remain available at all hours. This was presented as trust, but it carried an unspoken expectation that he would notice things and report them. Silence, once tolerated, was beginning to look like resistance. At the same time, he felt the shift in how others regarded him. The younger man who carried coal and water no longer avoided him. Instead, he watched him closely, as if measuring distance. Another servant, assigned to laundry, began asking questions that sounded casual but were not. Where had he been the night of the first death? Had he served at the neighboring house recently? The questions were not accusations, but they were rehearsals. Rumors moved faster than facts. Among the enslaved population, stories circulated that servants from other houses had been taken away for questioning and not returned. No one knew where they had gone or why. The uncertainty was deliberate. It allowed fear to fill the gaps. The main character became aware that his movements were being tracked. When he left a room, someone else entered shortly after. When he spoke with another servant, the overseer appeared nearby. Nothing overt was said, but the pattern was clear enough. He had been noticed, and attention, once focused, was difficult to escape. In response, he altered his behavior in small ways that could not easily be challenged. He shortened his interactions. He avoided familiar paths through the house, choosing longer routes that passed through more visible spaces. He allowed others to speak first and answered only when required. These adjustments did not eliminate suspicion, but they reduced opportunities for interpretation. Despite these efforts, pressure continued to build. A third household, loosely connected to the first two through business dealings, reported a sudden illness. The affected man did not die, but the resemblance to the previous cases was enough to reignite panic. This time, the response was immediate. The city's informal network of overseers and household managers began sharing information more openly. Servants were compared. Names were exchanged. Inside the house, the mistress began keeping written notes. She observed who served which meals, who handled which utensils, who entered which rooms. Her interest was not subtle. She watched hands as they moved, eyes as they lifted. The main character felt her attention like a weight, constant and impersonal. One afternoon, he was instructed to accompany the master to a neighboring house to assist with preparations for a small gathering. This was not unusual in itself, but the timing made it significant. He recognized the house as belonging to the family connected to the first death. His presence there, handling food and drink, placed him directly inside the growing web of suspicion. During the visit, he noticed changes similar to those in his own household: tightened routines, guarded conversations, servants moving under watchful eyes. He performed his duties without error and returned home without incident, but the experience left an impression. The network of elite households was closing ranks, and servants were being repositioned as potential threats rather than invisible labor. That evening, the overseer summoned him alone. The meeting took place in a small room off the main corridor, a space rarely used for anything else. The overseer did not sit. He spoke calmly, his questions precise. "You move between houses," he said. "You hear things." "Yes, sir," the main character replied. "You understand why we need to know what you hear?" "Yes, sir." The overseer did not ask a direct question. He did not accuse. He waited. The silence forced a decision. The main character could offer speculation, align himself with the overseer's expectations, and potentially redirect suspicion away from himself. Or he could maintain his previous posture of minimal response and risk being labeled uncooperative. He chose a third option. He spoke of harmless details, changes in routine, nervousness among servants, nothing that could be interpreted as intent. His answers were truthful but incomplete. They satisfied the overseer temporarily without implicating anyone. The overseer listened, expression unreadable. When the conversation ended, he dismissed the main character without comment. No approval was given. No disapproval was stated. The uncertainty lingered. Among the enslaved servants, divisions deepened. One man, assigned to stable work, began openly cooperating with the overseer, offering information about others in exchange for small privileges. His behavior was noticed and resented, but no one confronted him. Another servant attempted to warn others when inspections were coming, quietly passing information through gestures and timing rather than words. Trust fractured along lines of perceived survival strategy. The main character found himself isolated. Those who feared association avoided him. Those who sought favor watched him. The older woman who had warned him before no longer spoke to him at all. Her silence was not abandonment, it was self-preservation. The pressure reached a point where inaction itself became a choice. One night, after the household had settled, the main character overheard a conversation between the master and a visiting associate. They spoke openly, assuming privacy. "They cannot prove anything," the associate said, "but they need to stop it." "They will," the master replied, "one way or another." The meaning was clear. Resolution did not require truth. It required a demonstration of control. The next morning, the overseer announced new restrictions. Servants would no longer rotate between households. Access to certain rooms would be revoked. Any deviation from assigned duties would be punished immediately. The announcement was delivered without emotion, as if reading a list of household tasks. Later that day, the younger man who carried coal was taken aside for questioning. He did not return by evening. No explanation was given. His absence was noted and then absorbed into the routine, as absences often were. That night, the main character faced a decision he could not delay further. He had information, small, circumstantial, but potentially dangerous if misinterpreted. He could offer it proactively, framing it in a way that aligned with the overseer's expectations, or he could continue to withhold it and risk being accused of concealment. He chose to act, not out of loyalty or malice, but calculation. He approached the overseer and spoke carefully, presenting his observations as concerns rather than accusations. He redirected attention toward patterns that did not involve himself, emphasizing inconsistencies that could be explained without assigning intent. The overseer listened closely. The conversation altered the direction of scrutiny. The main character understood immediately what he had done. He had not accused anyone directly, but he had influenced where suspicion would land. Someone else would now carry the weight that had been moving toward him. That night, sleep did not come. The choice he had made could not be undone. It had bought time, but at a cost that would soon become visible. By the end of the week, the household felt different. The focus of attention had shifted. The main character was no longer at the center of it, but the system itself had moved closer to violence. The first irreversible step had been taken, not by those in power, but by someone trying to survive beneath it. By the time the third phase of events began, the system no longer pretended that calm could be restored quietly. What had started as unease hardened into determination. The absence of clear evidence did not weaken authority, it liberated it. In Richmond's elite households, certainty had never been required to justify force. Suspicion, once validated by fear, was sufficient. The city's leadership did not issue proclamations or warnings. Instead, action filtered downward through overseers, household managers, and informal agreements between influential families who shared one priority above all others: preserving control. In the house where the main character lived, the change was immediate and unmistakable. The overseer's role expanded beyond supervision into something closer to adjudication. He no longer asked questions in search of consistency. He announced conclusions framed as concerns for order. Servants were separated from one another during work hours. Tasks that had once required cooperation were reassigned to isolate individuals. The architecture of the house itself became a tool, with doors locked not for security but to dictate movement and visibility. The main character felt the shift in his body before he could articulate it. The temporary relief he had gained by redirecting suspicion did not produce safety. Instead, it produced expectation. He was now seen as someone who could be useful. The overseer summoned him more frequently, sometimes for no reason other than to remind him that his actions were being observed and evaluated. Each meeting carried the implication that cooperation was not complete and might never be. At the same time, consequences began to manifest elsewhere. The younger man who had been taken aside earlier was not seen again. No explanation was offered to the household. His absence was treated as administrative rather than tragic, a correction rather than a loss. Among the enslaved servants, the disappearance became a reference point. Conversations shortened. Eye contact became rare. Everyone understood that the boundary between accusation and erasure was thin and easily crossed. Authority figures from outside the household began to appear. Men whose presence suggested broader coordination arrived to consult with the master and overseer. They spoke behind closed doors, but their arrival alone signaled escalation. This was no longer an internal matter. The pattern of unexplained deaths had reached a threshold where silence risked exposure, and exposure risked loss of reputation. Action, visible and decisive, was required. The main character became aware that lists were being made. Not written lists, but mental ones. Names were repeated in conversations. Certain servants were discussed more often than others. Patterns of access and proximity were analyzed, not to establish truth, but to justify intervention. The main character heard his own name mentioned once, briefly, followed by a pause and a correction. That pause carried more meaning than the mention itself. He was no longer a primary focus, but he was not excluded either. Punishments resumed with increased severity. One servant was accused of speaking disrespectfully to the mistress and beaten publicly. The stated reason was insolence, but the timing made the message unmistakable. Order was being reasserted through pain. Each punishment served as both correction and warning, reinforcing the idea that guilt was secondary to compliance. Within this environment, true loyalty surfaced. The man who had cooperated openly with the overseer gained small privileges and increased visibility. He began to accompany inspections, pointing out irregularities in others' behavior. His transformation from peer to instrument of authority was swift and irreversible. Some servants avoided him entirely. Others attempted to ingratiate themselves, offering information in hopes of protection. The community fractured along lines drawn by fear. Conversely, acts of quiet resistance emerged, though none could be called organized. A servant delayed a task just long enough to allow another to avoid scrutiny. A door was left unlocked for a moment longer than permitted. These gestures were small and dangerous, offering no promise of success. They existed not to challenge the system, but to assert a measure of agency within it. The main character observed all of this with heightened awareness. His position inside the house allowed him to see the system adjusting itself in real time. He recognized that his earlier choice, to redirect suspicion without naming a culprit, had not resolved anything. It had merely altered the trajectory. The pressure he had deflected was now accumulating elsewhere, and the system, unsatisfied, was preparing to release it violently. That release came sooner than expected. One evening, as preparations were underway for a small dinner, a disturbance erupted in the kitchen. A servant dropped a dish, shattering it loudly. The sound drew immediate attention. The overseer entered the room within seconds, his response disproportionate to the incident. He accused the servant of carelessness bordering on sabotage. The accusation escalated rapidly, untethered from the original mistake. Within minutes, the servant was restrained and removed from the room. The main character watched, understanding that the incident was not about the broken dish. It was about demonstrating readiness to act. The servant's fate was decided before the dish hit the floor. The following morning, the servant was punished publicly. The severity exceeded anything seen in recent weeks. No explanation was given beyond a vague reference to repeated misconduct. The punishment concluded not with dismissal, but with removal. The servant was taken away. Like the others, he did not return. The cumulative effect was unmistakable. Fear ceased to be abstract. It became procedural. That same day, the main character was summoned again by the overseer. This time, the tone of the meeting was different. There was no pretense of inquiry. The overseer spoke as one issuing terms. "You have been helpful," he said. "That is noted. But usefulness must be consistent." The implication was clear. Cooperation was not a past act. It was an ongoing obligation. The overseer then presented information, partial, carefully framed, about another servant. Details were offered selectively, emphasizing opportunity and access without proof. The overseer did not ask the main character to confirm or deny anything. He asked him to respond. The moment demanded a decisive action. Silence would be interpreted as reluctance. Agreement would formalize an accusation. Qualification or deflection might be seen as evasion. The main character understood that whatever he said would shape the next phase of events. He chose to act decisively, not by inventing evidence, but by completing the narrative the overseer had already begun. He confirmed patterns of behavior, contextualized access, and reinforced the logic being constructed. His words did not introduce new facts, but they validated the existing suspicion. In doing so, he crossed a threshold. He became an active participant in the machinery of accusation. The consequences were swift. The servant whose behavior had been discussed was detained later that day. The household observed the removal without comment. No one intervened. Intervention was no longer possible. That night, the main character felt the weight of his decision settle into permanence. He had acted to preserve his own survival within a system that demanded sacrifice. The cost was now embodied in another person's absence. There was no mechanism for appeal, no opportunity for reversal. The system had accepted his contribution and moved forward. The escalation continued beyond the household. Word spread that the authorities believed they were closing in on the source of the problem. This belief did not require accuracy. It required momentum. Additional inspections were scheduled. The network of elite families coordinated responses, sharing strategies rather than information. The objective was no longer to identify the cause of the deaths. It was to demonstrate that the system could still assert dominance. Within the enslaved community, despair deepened. Hope of restraint vanished. Survival strategies narrowed to endurance and invisibility. The older woman who had once warned the main character avoided him completely now, her silence heavy with understanding. She knew what his survival had required. The moral question that had hovered at the edges of the story now moved to its center. The main character could no longer tell himself that he was merely enduring circumstances imposed upon him. He had acted. His action had consequences for others. Yet the choice had not been between good and evil. It had been between exposure and concealment, between immediate death and deferred guilt. As the household prepared for another gathering meant to signal stability to the outside world, tension saturated every movement. The main character served as instructed, aware that the system he had aided was still unstable. The deaths that had triggered this escalation remained unexplained. The violence inflicted in response had not resolved the underlying fear. It had only demonstrated capacity for control. He understood then that the climax approaching would not hinge on truth being revealed. It would hinge on the system deciding that enough blood had been drawn to reassert order, or that more was required. The path forward no longer depended on his choices alone. But the irreversible step he had taken ensured that he would be implicated in whatever came next, whether as witness, participant, or expendable asset. The machinery was in motion, and it would not stop gently. By the time the confrontation arrived, it no longer announced itself as a singular event. It emerged as the inevitable convergence of pressures that had been deliberately cultivated. Authority had been primed to act, fear had been normalized, and the threshold for violence had been lowered through repetition. What remained was to select the moment and the form through which control would be publicly reaffirmed. In Richmond's elite circles, the appearance of resolution mattered more than its substance, and the method chosen reflected that priority. The house at the center of these events prepared to host a formal gathering meant to demonstrate stability, confidence, and moral order, even as the foundation beneath it was already fractured. The preparations were extensive and tightly supervised. Servants were assigned fixed positions and instructed not to deviate under any circumstances. The overseer positioned himself at strategic points within the house, ensuring that movement was visible and controlled. Additional men, some from neighboring households, some whose authority derived from informal arrangements rather than official titles, were present under the guise of assistants. Their true purpose was understood by everyone involved. They were there to observe, to intervene, and to ensure that no uncertainty disrupted the performance. The main character was assigned to serve inside the dining room throughout the evening. This was not presented as a test, but it was one. His proximity to the guests placed him within reach of both scrutiny and consequence. He understood that his survival depended not on avoiding attention, but on navigating it without provoking response. He adjusted his posture, his timing, his expressions, calibrating them with the precision of someone who had learned that neutrality was not passive but constructed. As the guests arrived, the house filled with controlled conversation. Men of influence spoke about trade, legislation, and civic responsibility, deliberately avoiding any reference to the recent deaths. The omission was itself a statement. Silence functioned as denial, and denial as authority. The mistress moved through the room with practiced composure, greeting each guest with assurance. The master maintained an air of calm engagement, reinforcing the impression that order had been restored. Yet beneath this surface, signals passed between those in control. A nod exchanged. A pause held slightly too long. The overseer's eyes tracked movement continuously, cataloguing behavior not for deviation but for opportunity. The system did not require a spontaneous disruption. It required a moment that could be shaped into justification. That moment arrived not through defiance, but through exhaustion. One of the remaining servants, a woman assigned to assist with service, hesitated briefly while carrying a tray. The hesitation was minor, barely perceptible, but it occurred at the wrong time and in the wrong place. A glass shifted. Liquid spilled onto the tablecloth. The sound cut through the room. Conversation stopped. The overseer moved immediately. His response was swift and disproportionate, his authority filling the silence before it could settle. He accused the woman of carelessness, then of disrespect, then of endangering the household. The escalation followed a familiar pattern, each charge building upon the last without requiring proof. The woman attempted to speak, to apologize, but her words were cut off. She was restrained in full view of the guests. The room remained silent. No one intervened. The guests watched without expression, their stillness an endorsement. The performance had begun. The main character stood frozen in position, acutely aware that his own role was being evaluated alongside the unfolding punishment. He understood that his previous cooperation had placed him inside the machinery now activating. His presence was not incidental. It was confirmatory. The system required witnesses who could later attest that order had been maintained. The woman was removed from the room and taken to the yard. The gathering resumed after a brief pause, conversation restarting with forced normalcy. The interruption was framed as a regrettable necessity, evidence that discipline was still enforced. The guests accepted this explanation without question. Later, as the evening progressed, the overseer summoned the main character to the yard. What occurred there was not framed as an investigation or a trial. It was framed as correction. The woman was accused formally of endangering the household through negligence that bordered on intent. The charges were vague by design, allowing authority to interpret them as needed. The punishment was delivered publicly, with witnesses drawn from both the enslaved population and the household's guests. The main character was positioned close enough to see clearly, close enough to be seen seeing. The violence was deliberate and controlled, calibrated to communicate consequence rather than chaos. When it ended, the woman was not returned to the house. She was removed entirely, her fate left unspecified. The act satisfied the immediate demand for demonstration, but it did not resolve the underlying tension. The deaths that had initiated the escalation remained unexplained. The system, having asserted itself through visible cruelty, now faced a second requirement: closure. Closure did not mean truth. It meant assigning guilt in a manner that could be accepted and circulated. That assignment occurred later that night. The main character was summoned again, this time to a private room where the master, the overseer, and one external authority figure were present. The atmosphere was calm, almost procedural. He was informed that a determination had been made regarding responsibility for the recent disturbances. The determination rested on patterns of access and opportunity rather than evidence. He was asked to confirm details he had previously provided. Not to expand upon them, not to revise them, but to restate them. His confirmation would complete the record, informal though it was. His refusal would mark him as unreliable. He confirmed. In doing so, he sealed the outcome. Another servant, already isolated, already under suspicion, was designated as the source of the threat. The decision was framed as unfortunate but necessary. The language used emphasized protection of the household and the broader community. No mention was made of proof. The next morning, the designated servant was removed before dawn. The removal was quiet, efficient, and final. No public punishment followed. The spectacle had already served its purpose. This was administrative. In the days that followed, the elite households of Richmond began to relax their precautions. Social visits resumed. Surveillance laissant. The narrative circulated that the issue had been resolved. The lack of further deaths was taken as confirmation, though no causal link was established. Stability was declared restored. Inside the house, the effects were more complex. The main character was neither rewarded nor punished. His access remained, but it carried a different weight. He was no longer simply trusted. He was implicated. The overseer treated him with measured approval, a recognition that bound him more tightly to the system. The mistress avoided his gaze entirely, her composure masking calculation rather than relief. Among the enslaved servants, his position became ambiguous. Some avoided him out of fear. Others regarded him with quiet resentment. No one spoke openly. Open speech had proven too dangerous. The community absorbed the losses and adjusted, as it had been conditioned to do. At night, the main character struggled with the consequences of his actions. He understood that the choices he had made were constrained, shaped by survival within a structure designed to eliminate alternatives. Yet understanding did not erase responsibility. He had participated in the process that selected victims to preserve order. The system had not forced his words. It had made them necessary. The climax of events did not arrive with revelation or justice. It arrived with normalization. Violence had been deployed, guilt assigned, and authority reaffirmed. The machinery slowed, satisfied for the moment. But the underlying moral fracture remained. The main character recognized that the question at the center of the story, who bore responsibility, had not been answered. It had been displaced. Responsibility had been redirected downward, absorbed by those without the means to resist or refute it. The true source of violence, the system itself, remained intact and unchallenged. As the house settled back into routine, the main character returned to his duties with the same precision he had always displayed. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, the cost of survival had become permanent. The confrontation had passed. The consequences were set. What remained was not resolution, but endurance. The days that followed the confrontation did not carry the weight one might expect from events of such severity. There was no formal acknowledgement of what had occurred, no public reckoning, no written account that might later demand explanation. Instead, normalcy returned with deliberate speed, as if routine itself could erase the memory of disruption. This was not denial born of confusion. It was denial as policy. In Richmond's elite households, stability was not the absence of violence but the successful containment of it. In the house where the main character lived, order reasserted itself through familiar patterns. Breakfast was served at the usual hour. Doors were unlocked again, though not all of them. The overseer reduced his visible presence, no longer sleeping nearby, no longer inspecting hands with the same frequency. The mistress resumed her previous distance from the kitchen, her authority restored without comment. To an outside observer, the household appeared unchanged. That appearance was carefully maintained. Yet the absences were impossible to ignore for those who lived inside the system. Several servants were gone. No replacements arrived immediately. Tasks were redistributed without explanation. The increased workload was treated as temporary, though no one believed it would be. The missing were not spoken of by name. To do so would invite questions, and questions were dangerous. The main character remained in his position. His access was preserved. His responsibilities continued. From a functional perspective, he had survived intact. From every other perspective, he had been altered in ways that could not be reversed. His interactions with authority figures changed subtly but significantly. The overseer addressed him less often, but when he did, His tone carried a new familiarity. Not warmth, but recognition. The overseer no longer tested him. He assumed compliance. This assumption was not trust. It was ownership reinforced through shared action. The main character understood that he had crossed a boundary from which retreat was impossible. He was now part of the mechanism that enforced order, even as it oppressed him. The mistress never confronted him directly. She did not thank him, accuse him, or acknowledge his role. Instead, she avoided him when possible, delegating instructions through others. Her avoidance was not born of fear or guilt. It was strategic. To recognize his agency would complicate the narrative she relied upon to justify her authority. Silence preserved clarity. Among the enslaved servants, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken understanding. The community had absorbed another demonstration of how quickly accusation could harden into removal. Those who remained adjusted their behavior accordingly. Conversations shortened further. Cooperation became transactional rather than communal. Acts of quiet warning diminished. Survival demanded isolation. The older woman who had once warned the main character did not return to speaking with him. Her silence was absolute. It was not punishment. It was acknowledgement. She knew what he had done, not because she had been told, but because the pattern was familiar. The system always required intermediaries. It always demanded participation from those it crushed. At night, when the house settled and the routines of the day gave way to enforced rest, the main character confronted the aftermath alone. There were no dramatic manifestations of remorse.
No beatings. No breakdowns.
What remained was a persistent awareness of consequence. He replayed the moments where different words might have altered outcomes, knowing that such alternatives were theoretical at best. The structure within which he had acted did not permit innocence. It permitted only degrees of complicity. The deaths that had initiated the chain of events were never explained publicly. No official cause was recorded that satisfied scrutiny. Doctors offered vague conclusions. Families accepted them without protest. The absence of further incidents was treated as confirmation that the response had been effective. Correlation was mistaken for resolution because resolution was required. Within elite circles, the narrative stabilized quickly. The disturbances were attributed to internal failings that had been corrected. The swift action taken was praised quietly among peers. The willingness to enforce discipline was interpreted as strength. The moral cost of that enforcement was neither calculated nor discussed. It did not need to be. The system rewarded outcomes, not ethics. For the enslaved population, the story took a different form. It circulated in fragments, whispered during brief moments of privacy, encoded in warnings passed from one person to another. Names were omitted. Details blurred. What remained consistent was the lesson. Proximity to power increased risk, and survival sometimes required decisions that could not be undone. The story did not offer heroes. It offered instruction. The main character became part of that oral memory, though not always as a figure with a fixed role. In some versions, he was a cautionary example of what access could cost. In others, he was a reminder that survival under such conditions demanded choices that defied simple judgment. These versions were never reconciled. They did not need to be. Their purpose was not accuracy, but preparation. Time passed. Weeks turned into months. The household continued to function. The master expanded his business interests. The mistress resumed hosting gatherings. The overseer rotated to other assignments, carrying with him the authority reinforced by recent events. The city of Richmond moved forward, its economy intact, its public conscience untroubled. The main character aged within this continuity. His body carried no new scars, but his posture changed subtly, shaped by the knowledge that he had seen the system reveal itself fully and had survived by aligning with its demands. He did not believe himself absolved. He did not believe himself uniquely guilty. Those distinctions had lost meaning. What remained was the central moral question: unresolved and unresolvable within the framework that had produced it. In a society that denied legal humanity to a portion of its population, responsibility was distributed unevenly by design. The system created conditions in which violence was inevitable, and then assigned guilt to those least able to resist it. Judgment, when it occurred, was never applied upward. The events that unfolded left no official record worth consulting. No trial transcripts.
No confessions.
No acknowledgement that injustice had occurred. What persisted instead was absence of names, of explanations, of accountability. History, as preserved by those in power, remained silent. Yet silence did not mean erasure. The memory endured in altered form, carried forward by those who had lived through it and those who learned from them. It existed not as a single story, but as a pattern repeated across households, across years, across generations. The pattern taught that when violence left no visible trace, the system itself was the evidence. For the viewer, the question that remains is not whether the main character acted rightly or wrongly. That framework assumes a freedom of choice that did not exist. The question is more uncomfortable and more necessary. When a system is built to produce harm while concealing its mechanisms, where does guilt reside? With the individual forced to choose between survival and complicity, or with the structure that made such choices inevitable? The story ends without resolution because history often does. What is remembered is incomplete. What is forgotten is intentional. And what remains demands not judgment of individuals trapped within the system, but recognition of the system itself as the enduring crime.